All right, welcome everybody. Happy New Year 2023. I'm so excited to start off the new year with my friend Alexa Linton, and we're both here in British Columbia. So for our respective ends of the province. So I'll let Alexa introduce herself and then we'll get started with our conversation.
All right. Hi, Sarah. I'm so stoked to be here and be with you. And yeah, some of you may know me through my podcast, the Whole Horse Podcast, or through some of my different work. And I, at the moment, in my newest reincarnation, am a practicing osteopathy practitioner and for humans. And I also still continue with my equine sport therapy practice of, I think it's coming on like 18 years now. And with that, continuing to develop, especially around equine cranial work and cranial therapy, seems to be a particular fascination of mine. And so with my friend Elise Miki, I'm currently well, we have a surprise coming, so I'll have to share that at a later date. But essentially, yeah, working on an equine cranial therapy courses and more upcoming. You'll hear more about. So that's a really exciting part of things. And I wrote a book once upon a time about animals transitioning, death and dying. And yeah, I've had a lifetime of really inner work around healing and trauma, and also hopefully being able to offer up some good things to clients and the people in my world around healing and supporting their nervous systems and supporting their well-being. And I'm just absolutely obsessed with horses, so it seems to be my my path in this this particular time around to support the increasing well-being and of horses, and really advocate for ethical horse care. So that's me in a nutshell.
Fantastic. That's a pretty big nutshell.
Yeah, a pretty big nutshell. I live in the Cowichan Valley, the unceded territory of the Cowichan peoples, and I have two horses, Diva and Raven. Well, not have. They have me and my dogs, Riley and Solo, and my cat, Makwa. So yeah, and my partner, Patrick. So that's us.
Quite the herd on quite the land. And I'm up here sort of, what, 10 hours apart, I think, Alexa. I'm on the Secwepemc territory in the central interior of British Columbia. So I'm sort of, I think by the time you take the ferry, it's probably maybe 10 hours.
Yeah, about that.
Down to you. Yeah.
Good chunk of a drive, that's for
Big
sure.
chunk of a drive, yeah.
Canada is large, everyone. Yes.
Oh boy. Yeah. And that's just one province. Like, that's just one small part of one province. I'm only halfway to the north of British Columbia. Like, that's
pretty nuts.
Yeah, Canada's huge.
Totally. Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad you've carved out this time for us today, Alexa. Thank you so much. And it's helpful too to hear the context a little bit at which, or from which, you come to looking at horses and looking at people and understanding things between them. And so I guess if I were to ask you the question, because my whole thing is, how do we have a better understanding of trauma in equines and trauma in humans, and how these things intersect, and how are we helping work at addressing these things so that, you know, we all can have better health outcomes, better well-being outcomes, that kind of idea. So if I were just to put that out there as a starting topic, I'm curious what grabs your attention from that you're feeling moved to start sharing as we begin our conversation today.
I think it's such an interesting topic on a number of levels. One, as an equine sport therapist, through that lens, maybe I'll start, because I've worked on a lot of horses over the years and with a lot of horses. And, you know, I do find, yeah, when we're thinking of trauma, we're thinking, you know, through that, into that space and how it impacts horses and what that looks like. you know, and it's probably been talked about here previously, but I find for myself, there's a few kind of like, shall we call them pivotal life events that seem to be like, you know, impactful, like not only for, shall we say, the emotional well-being of a horse, but also physically. So it shows up in the physical form, it shows up in the fascia, it shows up in the health and the well-being of the organ systems and the musculoskeletal system. And I think you and I are both well aware of the impact of trauma on the body in different ways. And so some of those things that I see from the beginning are often around this sense of transition, like, shall we say, transitions not gone wrong, but maybe done in a way that's extremely abrupt or like they're unprepared for the transition that's occurring. And so what it looks like often is that essentially that system can't cope with the transition. So for, you know, for example, like a weaning process that's done too early, too quickly, abruptly, with no preparation, that leaves scars, you know, from beginning to end, I would say, for many horses. And so that's one example. It was one of the other reasons that I decided to write my book on death and dying as well, because that is another area that I find can be really, really challenging. We live in a culture that doesn't talk about death and dying. We don't get into it most of the time. That's a generalization. It doesn't occur everywhere, but for the most part, we don't really talk about. We just hope it doesn't happen. And when it comes to our horses, you know, we sort of like try not to look at it until it's like right in our face and something's happened, or something like something we didn't expect, or something that some part of us expected but didn't want. And so what ends up happening is something that could have been like, you know, not easeful, but like a more gentle process, just like with weaning, becomes traumatic, becomes sort of negatively impactful for the herd, the person, the horse that is passing, like all these things, you know, as a weaning would be for the foal, the mare, you know, the herd, potentially the person, and the person that is receiving that horse as well is experiencing, whether they know it or not, the impact of that that transition gone, you know, gone south. And so that's something that I see a lot of, whether it be the weaning. I also see that in horses removed quickly or without preparation from a herd that they were very attached to, horses removed from people that they were very attached to quickly. This is very, very common, right? You sell your horse, you never see them again. And they may have had a really deep emotional connection. And oftentimes those are the times where people, their coping mechanism is like, I can't see that anymore. I can't continue a connection because it hurts me too much. And so it becomes this pivotal moment, this line in the sand in that horse's existence that shows up in the body, shows up in these various ways in terms of well-being and yeah, vitality and all these pieces, right? So this is something I often see for like, you know, a lot of horses are experiencing these things, and I, you know, I hope to be, you know, helpful for at least a few around some of these transitions, particularly death and dying. Weirdly enough, I'm really good at that, and around helping with that. And you would be amazed, Sarah, to know horses are very specific about what they want. Mm-hmm. Very specific. And and I guess just like sharing with the people listening to sort of soothe you, like in terms of like that transition, is that your horse is much closer to the natural cycle of death, like life and death, than necessarily we are as humans. They don't have all this story created around it. It is quite, I've rarely met a horse that's actually afraid of it. They're more afraid of you not being able to handle it or cope.
Mhm.
And that goes for most animals. And so if what I've seen is that if we can kind of get into a good space, obviously, like I wrote my book, I called it Death Sucks, like, because it always does. There's nothing that takes that away, but it can really suck a lot less when we're prepared and ready, and we are able to actually energetically and emotionally release this horse into the process of what is meant to be for them. And we can hold the space in a dare I say, sacred way for this transition that is very important and sacred. It's literally this change of state that's incredibly important. And I know a lot of horse people, we're so at odds with death and dying that I've heard many instances where they're not even present when the horse passes. And I get that they're so big and it's so challenging. Absolutely. And let me just say that, like, I think I've seen 2 horses in my entire career that have died of natural means.
Mhm.
So this is another hard part of it. It just doesn't happen, like, it just kind of like dogs. Dogs are similar. It's very rare that a dog will die of their own means,
Mhm.
because they live in domestication, and the natural causes that would shift the tables are not there. And the body is a very resilient thing. So generally, this means that there's a vet involved and different things involved. It's a different type of process. But it's one of the things that I love supporting around, because I think what I've seen is the more prepared we are, and the more kind of open our heart is to that process, and the more willing we are to be a witness, the more it's not a trauma, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a completed cycle.
And what I think is so interesting in hearing all this, because I'm hearing you speak, and my mind and my body are just like pinging off of all sorts of things, is death doesn't need to be traumatizing, but it brings up a lot of people's trauma.
It
And
does.
because whether it's our own unresolved stuff, and our own coping mechanism is to avoid or to shut down or to suppress or hold it in our bodies, and we've found ways of managing difficult experiences in our lives, and this is just another one of those things. And so because of that rigidity or that contraction, we enter into things like existential things like death and dying with the same kind of contraction. So that makes it harder already. Like you said, death sucks. It's not an easy thing. And if you're coming at this idea of death and existential angst or grief, not from a death positive perspective, but from a place of terror and fear, because I that's how I cope with my own world, is I tend to cope by segmenting things off. And then it can be harder, like you said, than it needs to be, because there's this layer or these layers added on top of the thing itself. And then within that, there's all the nuances around relationship and loss and connection or lack thereof, or, shame, or, all the things that we just haven't sort of touched on or dealt with that come up in the process of the thing. And then if the thing itself is handled in a challenging way or has difficulty around it, rather the like you said, the helpers, the professional helpers that are involved are not available, or they're not helpful emotionally, or they're, like, right, like there's almost like, I have a colleague in the EQUUSOMA community, Karen Kaler, who's a death doula.
Yep.
And she also does animal communication, and her main area is death and dying with horses and equine transitions and equines transitioning and helping owners. And so I would love to have a conversation with the two of you actually at some point, because I think that would be fascinating, if she's willing. But this idea of like, you know, how was this process, if we come into the world in a birthing sort of sequence, and we exit the world in a similar sequence, you know, there's a birthing into dying, so to speak, you know, like what didn't get to happen in the early birthing sequence that is now showing up as the unresolved ruptures or difficulties or traumas that are now coming up in the exiting process, not just the arrivals, right? So whatever arrivals stuff hasn't been dealt with often starts to show up in the exiting. And so it becomes really, really interesting, for sure.
It sure does. It sure does. There's, you know, and with animals, you have this added piece, which is you're making the call. You're playing God.
Yeah.
Now that is a very strange place to be. And there's a lot, it's a loaded question around timing. For a lot of people, this is like too soon, too late, like there's this, I don't want to, you know, I don't want to be in that position of that kind of responsibility. Right.
Yeah.
And, yeah, and it is so interesting, because oftentimes, you know, what happens is it's too late. Like, right. It's been left too long. And the only reason I say that, because the timing is always perfect, but sometimes what you'll see is the horse has accrued more trauma because their body is breaking down so badly.
Yeah.
And there's so much pain.
Yeah.
And that suffering may, you know, like it might have been different potentially, depending on our state and what what we're able to get to. I had a girlfriend of mine, and I supported her in the transition of her mare, who was her heart horse, her everything, you know, her life. And it was so interesting to me, because this mare chose the timing, and this woman had become so close to her that she could be with that and listen, even though there was this sense, you know, of, oh, it's too soon. It's too soon. And she lived for this horse, right? And it was a beautiful thing to witness, because she let this mare lead the process. Where does she want to be buried? What does that look like? Who does she want support from? You know, which vet needs to come out? How does that look? What kind of day should it be? Like literally, you know, and like even the weather, right? Like all these things. She trusted so implicitly what was intuitively coming through in that process. And honestly, it was just so beautiful. As heartbreaking as it was also like just in the sweet spot, you know. And if she'd left it even a week later, the weather, I think this was last year with all the floods, and like everything just shifted right after that, and was like, oh, it was the perfect space. And, you know, for a lot of people that wouldn't have happened. They would have allowed her health to decline more, which is okay. But I remember her saying to me, I'd rather a month too soon than a month too late. And it just kind of broke my heart, but also like opened it up. I was like, wow, like that is so, like, there's something in that for me, because so often it is later, because we just can't get there, like to imagine ourselves without that being. And for her, it was like, no, this is what it needs to be, for her to be in that sweet spot and die in the way that she wants to, because it's her life, right? Yeah. And that was very profound to witness. Yeah. Yeah. Like in a, you know, I cry a little bit with it, talking about it. I was very close to this mare. She's actually related to my mare very closely. And I worked on her for, 7 or 8 years. I became very close to her person. So I have that connection, but it's also from that space of these two had a connection that I sort of think of like my connection with Diva. And it's like, would I be able to do that? Like, be so unselfish and giving to that, I hope so. I do hope so. We'll find out. Yeah. Yeah.
There's
So
that permission. This like the permission to go piece, it's the permission to go. And
huge.
right. And that brings up so much for people.
Oh God. Yeah.
That permission, like, you don't need to hang on for me,
Completely. Yep.
right? You're free to go. I love you. You were loved. I still love you. You will still be loved. And, and then that transition of the allowing of the journeying to happen. I think, Alexa, my father passed away this past year. And it was a real blessing to be able to be with him in his final weeks. Unknowingly, like, we knew he wasn't doing well, and he got a diagnosis of cancer back in 2019. It's not a cancer that runs in our family. It was completely blindsided all of us because we didn't know, like, what is this all about,
Yeah.
And he did well the first few years in treatment. He went into remission. He did great, and then his last year, it just, so it didn't, unfortunately, the timing of that didn't work well with the pandemic. And so, his good years that we had with him, I wasn't able to see him because the pandemic, with the lockdowns, we weren't able to see each other. But I did get to spend time with him in his final 3 weeks and be with him with the journeying in and out of consciousness. And it was so fascinating and moving, and almost like a spiritual rite of passage to be with him as I kind of describe it almost, and I don't know if you have a similar analogy for when you're doing this with horses or accompanying horses on this journey, but and I've had this with dogs, but it's a bit different, because when I've had dogs put down and I've been with my dogs in their final moments, it's very different. It's not, because it's ended medically, right? Asia, we're doing the end. The ending is very, it's peaceful, it's beautiful, but it isn't the death laboring, as I call it. There's the laboring into life, and then there's the laboring into death. And we're so disconnected from that, I think, just because of modern Western cultures. Now, that's not, again, this is a broad sweeping generalization, of course, but with, like, my dad, obviously there wasn't, like, he was dying in a natural way. He took his leave, and we were with him up until when he finally took his leave, and he did that in the middle of the night when no one was there. I think he wanted to go on his own, and so he did. And so, but it was cool to watch the final days and the final hours. And I was the last family member with him, and he passed a few hours later. And so the death laboring, as I have come to call it, or the journeying in and out of these altered states of consciousness, and there's something to that. It's like there's the work of being born, and then there's the work of leaving this form back into from whence we came, so to speak. And like you said, you've had 2 horses where you've been able, I don't know, that you know of anyway, that were able to have that transitioning. And because with family pets, dogs, cats, horses, etc., we do tend to do the euthanasia thing more commonly. We're not privy to this more natural journeying, laboring process. And so I was wondering if you were willing to share a little bit about what you've witnessed in that, like, because I remember being with my dad in that and going, wow, like, this is really, like, profoundly fascinating and moving to see him. Almost like the analogy I gave was like, it's like a labyrinth. And you can see that they're less and less available, but then when they make their way back out and try to connect, And then it's like, okay, and they're there with you, but the eyes have started rolling, but they're not really quite there. And then they're gone again back into the labyrinth, and they go a little deeper next time, and then they're further gone, and they can sort of hear you because they kind of turn their head towards you when you're talking, but they can't see you. And
Yeah.
then maybe they come back out, they follow a ball of string back out to like out of the labyrinth again, and there's some sort of presence, but you can tell they're no longer here or meant to be here. They're on their way somewhere else.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to watch the in and out of the labyrinth, and like following the thread back out to us and then back into wherever he's going next with my dad. And then there comes a point where there is no more of that.
Yeah.
And that coming out stops happening. And then the transition has happened fully into whatever is coming next. And so like, what have you seen with horses where that natural process gets to unfold? Because it's so uncommon.
It's so uncommon. And honestly, I've never witnessed it. The ones that did die in that way were, I think one was a heart attack.
Okay.
It was extremely fast and sudden.
Okay. So not so journeying like that.
No.
Yeah.
And he was fairly young, if I remember correctly. I think he was maybe, 18 or 19.
Yeah.
And I think the other one was similar. And so it's interesting with horses. I mean, I think this is a super important topic around trauma and like domestic lifestyle as well, the impact of that. So, if we think of a horse in the wild, number one, they're going to be impacted far less by some of the things that, I mean, when we look at horses, what are the things that horses generally pass from? Number one, colic. Right? That's like far and beyond. So this is a extremely stressful, extremely painful situation.
Yeah.
And generally the vet is going to call it, at a certain time, or there'll be a surgical procedure, like something is going to happen to, kind of shift that, right? And obviously extremely hard, because it's challenging for this not to be traumatizing for horse and human, because there's so much distress, right? In a scenario like this. The other thing that I commonly see is another kind of, I would say, domestication thing is things like pain and arthritis that's increasingly uncomfortable and unbearable for the horse. So, a joint issue, a tendon issue, these sorts of things where, things again tend to be cut shorter than the natural lifespan would allow, because we have a huge animal bearing on four legs that comes to a point where they can't do that without extreme amounts of pain and a huge change to their quality of life.
I was going to say laminitis sort of falls in that category a little bit.
Exactly. Founder laminitis. I supported in a transition of, I believe he was, and this is the hard one when you lose horses that are very young and where you have to make that call. Like, I think he was 10.
Yeah.
And he was done. They'd thrown absolutely everything at him that they could possibly do. And he was living with this extreme chronic pain in his feet. And he was very, very clear, so I do a lot of intuitive work, and he was extremely clear. It's my time. He knew exactly where it was so funny, Sarah, like he knew exactly where he wanted to be buried. Not only that, he knew exactly the orientation that he wanted to be in the hole, so that he could have this particular view down the valley, and he knew exactly what he wanted to be buried with. There were certain, like his halter and these various things that were very important for him. It was super, super clear. And, at the ease that he went with it, that's often how, it's like, oh, this was the time, right? There's just there's no fighting it. They just go with that. And so those are the things that are often challenging, because we don't always, it's very rare that a horse gets to that place where they're dying of old age.
Yeah. Or
Very
some natural cause of some
or
sort.
natural causes.
Some sort, yeah.
Right. and so we don't always see, like, the sense I got with your dad was like, yeah, the life force is ebbing and flowing, but there's a sense of he's able to ride it. It's not this overwhelming pain, these sorts of things, right? And so he can ride that wave. And I think that's such a beautiful thing to be able to transition in that way. And I think with domestication, it's just changed the trajectory for a lot of horses. And I just haven't seen really that sense of a horse getting to a point where they're like, totally done with their life force, totally complete with that, in a way that they could transition easily on their own, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah, because I've seen a few different articles and stuff over time of like, how do horses grieve, and it's so fascinating whether the stories are of sort of wild or feral horses and how they do it sort of out there without human interference. Obviously humans are observing because otherwise it would not have been documented, but
yes.
Or some sort of semi-managed herd, or in domestication when horses are able to be there when the other animal is put down, and that process of being able to have that closure, for lack of a better word. I'm not trying to anthropomorphize, but the equine version of closure of those relationships, right, is really interesting about horse grief within herd.
They do it together. It's a community process.
They'll stand by the body. They'll make noises. Like it's interesting. There's this shared mammalian experience of loss and letting go. And certainly there are species-based differences, obviously, but it's so interesting about, that there's still this need to transition. If we're transitioning into the world, there's a transition out. If we're entering into relationships, how are we exiting those relationships and allowing for those nuances to transition, to allow to hold the space for that to happen.
If you think of like cycles of completion, it's that sense of like, very often, so say we had our horse at a boarding stable, right? They may have like a specific area where they're put down, and then we don't always think in those spaces because the horses are separated in their paddocks, and that sort of, sense for us is, they are separate. But what we need to recognize is they are not separate. They are, whether or not they can touch each other, still herded up in a manner of speaking, because that's just how they roll. And so in those situations, you can have a trauma coming from a horse not being able to understand, where did that horse go? And like, what happened, right? Because maybe they were not taken to see the body, and there wasn't that sense of them having that recognition that this horse has passed, or, feeling like we need to protect our rest of our herd from that. And I say, please, if you can, if you feel safe doing so, either lead them out to the body or let them out within the space where the body is, to allow that process to complete, and for them to have that shift in their nervous system that says, okay, something has changed here, and there's something to be with here, right? And it takes, some horses might come over, sniff, and leave, and others, it's a very elaborate process for them. There's all these differences that happen. And, when you get horses, I've worked previously with one particular horse that was passing, and he was very much an anchor horse for this herd. And he had one particular horse that he really provided this, filled this need for, to be an anchor, to be a steady presence. And so we actually did a lot of kind of work behind the scenes using like energy medicine, and just trying to like help this other horse move through what was, needing to happen here, right, in a good way, so that he didn't get so stressed, was like, okay, so that we can like help everybody settle and understand what's occurring here. So sometimes they need like additional support depending, on what's going on for them. And, it's just like with us, right? Like, if we live in a vacuum and we don't have any previous trauma or other things that have happened, then, maybe we can handle that in such a graceful way. But if we do have stuff that we're bringing to it, it might look a lot different, right? And there might be kind of more that comes up around it, and so with this horse, he had previous trauma around his mom and his weaning in that time. So this horse sort of represented that for him again, right? So we get this kind of recurrence of a abandonment wound or whatever we want to call it, right? When this horse passes, okay, how do we work with that? So it was quite an interesting process to be with, sort of connecting along the way, making sure that he had what he needed to move forward from this change, and that there were maybe some other horses that could come in and fill some of those needs for him. Thankfully, it was a larger herd, so there was some possibility for some constellation shifts in that to allow him to feel supported. But that's something I think, for us, we can remember that, like, if you have a horse that's really struggling after the passing or even the moving away of a herd mate, thinking along those levels, okay, how can I help to fill a need here? What might this horse require? And not kind of going, oh, it can't be that, it can absolutely be that that's going on. Yeah.
Especially if you start to see difficulties with your horse in terms of behavior or emotional state, or activation levels or shutdown levels, or their capacity for connection, or their interest or willingness to, do whatever, is expected, or I hate that languaging, but like if there's any kind of change, not to discount the nature of these kinds of disruptions, especially if we consider that most horses in domestication or in captivity, so to speak, most of them have had early weaning that was abrupt, like you were saying, right? So there's already a foundation of potentially insecure attachment, developmental ruptures, so to speak, relational shock traumas. We talk about shock trauma being more like the physical stuff, like an injury, an accident, a physical harm of some kind, but there's relational shock traumas, right? The shock of attachment failing in some way, or a loss, or a disconnect, or not being seen, or being harmed, or neglect, or what have you. And so all of these are these little shocks that the nervous system has to kind of absorb. And so if the horse has like a lot of this history, and so many horses have they've changed hands so many times.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
They've changed herds so many times. And I think about like how all of this creates a stacked effect on the average domesticated horse, where they're expected to just put up and shut up and tolerate and move on, and put up and shut up and tolerate and move on. And when you look at horses in the wild, and this is where I love ethology so much, because you look at sort of under natural / optimal conditions, not that natural conditions are always optimal, but when life unfolds the way the species has evolved to be, they don't have those same disruptions. The horses, the babies are weaned naturally. They stay in their family bands, more or less, with some exceptions. There aren't the interruptions. There's not human handling and abuses and captivity conditions and all these constraints. And so they've got this continuity effect, where there's relational continuity and herd continuity. And then so by the time that like death and dying happens, there's that continuity again. Usually like the herd can be there with the body, and it's all sort of done within continuity. And our domesticated horses, it's all rupture, break, rupture, break, rupture, break, rupture, break, stack, 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 stack. And it's like, oh, and so suddenly, we have this death and dying thing that happens. A horse friend leaves, dies, moves to another barn, etc. And then the horse is having difficulties, and we just go, well, put up and shut up, keep
Get
going.
on with it.
Get on with it, because maybe that's how we've learned how to cope with our traumas and our stuff in our lives, is to disconnect, suppress, shut down, get over it, because we were told to do so, or that was the best option for us, and so we impose our own coping onto the animal, and then we end up having these problems. And it's like, oh, well, hang on a second here, Is it anthropomorphizing to talk about horse grief, or is it actually anthropocentric to deny horse grief,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I go, okay, is this take this into consideration of all the other stacked variables and all the other ruptures that have occurred along the way, and then take into consideration that your horse is breeding and its temperament and all these other little variables that are part of this, and the handling and your relationship and how attuned or not you are, and all of this. If you look at it all, it's like, oh, okay, like stepping back and really finding that graciousness around all of that,
Mm-hmm.
because
And
there's
there's
so much. Yeah.
so much. I was going to say
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
just multitude of factors. I
Yeah.
was chatting with someone the other day, and she was talking about, a movement towards, yeah, even looking more specifically at the breeding process. Is like, are the stallion and mare balanced,
Yeah.
or they breed? Like these sorts of things, right? Where are they on board with this process?
Are they, are they wanting to do this?
Completely.
Is
Does it
this
feel reasonably
chosen?
consensual? Like,
Right. Yeah.
so, right from that conception moment, like what, like when we start to kind of look over that timeline of our particular horses, and, unfortunately, yes, it's challenging because for the most part, we have no idea what happened. Like, no clue. Diva, for me, like, I was her fourth home at age 4.
Right.
Right? And that's normal. Like, it wasn't like a weird thing. She went from her breeder to another person at like 6 months old to like 2.5 years old, then a trainer who sold her to me.
Yeah.
Not abnormal. But
Right. Yeah.
when you look at that, you're a long ways away. Like, I don't even know her birth date. I don't know when she was born. I have no idea. What the situation was. And so it's challenging because, yeah, we're kind of always guessing, like, like, okay, was that something that happened? Raven's a little bit different. I know most of her history, I would say, or, I know some of the factors that have led to, her health concerns now. But still there's gaps, and it's like, even if you reached out to someone and was like, I know you bred this horse, can you tell me every tiny thing that happened and all the accidents they had and
Yeah.
what your training style was like? And like,
What's your attachment style? How does that
completely, like,
influence training response to your horse? Like you can't start psychoanalyzing the breeder, right? Like you just can't.
and that's the
But,
thing. So you're
right.
always a little bit out to lunch and
Yeah.
guessing, which is like a tricky part. The nice thing is the body is usually fairly like
Yeah.
open to, sharing some of the pieces of this puzzle, but it is mysterious, like more so than any animal, domesticated animal. I think, like, as far as dogs and cats and horses are concerned, like, horses are mysterious this way. And I can imagine that many people watching and listening, like, you've had that moment of pulling your hair out of like, I don't know what happened, or they're having a trigger or a reaction and you're like, where did this come from? Like, we just don't know, right?
The beauty of working from a somatic or a relational perspective, right? Understanding
Yeah.
the nervous system and stuff and relational things. What I love about this is phenomenology at its finest, right? Is phenomenology is like where you're working with the phenomenon as it's occurring in the moment, the patterns, the sequences, etc.
Yes.
You might never know the story, right? The verbal story, the chronology, the actual narrative that comes along with it. When you have it, gosh, is it ever lovely when you've got it, because it kind of fills in the pieces. And for some humans, we don't even have that. When I think when I'm
Totally.
working somatically with a human as the client, I don't always have the histories, especially, if the parents of the client have passed, they're not around to tell the birth story, they're not around to talk about the early years, maybe they were adopted or in foster care or what have you, and so what you do have to work with is the sequencing and and the changes in state and what happens emotionally, what happens just before that and just before that and just after that and just after that, and all that tells its own story.
Mhm.
And so it's like we can keep looking for the whys, and sometimes we don't get the whys because that's the mental narrative. And
Totally.
again, lovely when you can get it right, but with horses especially, we don't have this. I mean, I'm really fortunate. Like my two horses, I know who their breeders are. I befriended them on Facebook. I've discovered them after the fact. And I'm both of my horses' second owners. So they were purchased after they were weaned from their breeders. They had an initial owner post breeder,
Yep.
and then I'm the second owner of both. So I know who their breeders are, I don't know the initial owner per se of one of them, because of how the purchasing process went. I got the second one off of like a horse flipper. So he kind of was the intermediary between the initial owner and me. So technically third, I suppose you could say, but I see it as the second owner because she was only with him for a very short time as a transition. But like, I know the breeders, but I don't know the small details, right? I know where they were born. I know where their farms were, where they, but I don't know what ages they were when they were weaned. I don't know what handling methods they experienced. I don't know how long they got to stay with the herd, if they were separated out. Like there's all this early developmental stuff that I don't know, even though I know the breeders. I have birth dates for my horses. I'm very fortunate, and in both my cases, I know who the dads were. The dads are registered APHA stallions in both of my cases, but the moms were non-papered random mares that don't really have any clear breeding. So like there's a lot I don't know. And there's some stuff I do, but even the stuff I do doesn't completely give me, the full picture. So we can only work off of the phenomenology. So it's like, okay, so what's happening in this moment as we're hanging out with these things, and then being with that and being with what the body is offering, being with what the behavior is offering, what the emotions are offering in the nervous system. And all of that tells it's a story, and that's what we end up getting to work with,
I love that because that's like, when you're doing body work and some training as well, you kind of like stumble across these particular behavior patterns or particular holding patterns, tensional patterns in the system. And they make you go, like, what's that about? I just happened upon one the last couple of weeks with Raven. I'd been really, really interested in this, particular, it's called the body movement method. And it was developed by a body worker around the thoracic sling activation and proper thoracic sling movement and activation. And Raven is interesting in terms of her thoracic sling. So when I first met Raven, she was a client of mine. And her sternum, I kid you not, stuck out from her chest like 2.5 inches, like a mast of a ship. And her whole thorax was just totally asymmetrical. And she developed early onset arthritis in her left front coffin joint. So by the time she was 4, she was on daily Previcox. So this is kind of just to give you some background. Anyways, she's just the most curious case as well. She's got digestive issues, all these things. So I know some about her birth and various things. And so, but it never quite all came together. It was like, did she have an accident? Something happened here, and I'm just not sure what, but I know that the nerve flow to that left front leg was somehow distorted and changed. And that more than likely caused this arthritic changes and, this literal change in the hoof shape and the bottom of this particular leg and her foundation. And so it was so interesting to me. And then, how things just you just get that piece of information that you're like, oh, and in this course, it was like, oh, some babies, some foals don't fully unfold their wings when they come out into the world. They stay kind of held up in their thorax and in their thoracic sling and sort of compressed in that area. And as soon as she said that, I was like, oh, geez, that's what it is. Tick.
Yeah.
And, some of the behavioral things there was so interesting. In this particular course, she teaches it, a number of steps, and they're kind of like training, but not quite. But one of the first ones is around a little bit of contact on the rein, like just a little bit. Now, interestingly enough, Raven has never accepted contact.
Right.
And I've always been able to work around it because we don't ride much, and she's so willing otherwise, and I can use clicker training and target training and various things to work around it. But if you actually just ask her for contact with the rein, she'll resist it.
Yeah.
Every time.
Right.
And I was like, okay, well, that's just Raven. Well, it was like, oh, because of course her thoracic sling isn't working. So she can't relax her neck muscles enough to release into the contact, because she uses those almost solely to hold her body up.
Yes.
And her shoulder up. And I was like, these pieces start just falling into place. And I'm sure, people listening, it's like, oh yeah, like I've had those moments where, especially listening to stuff like this, you'll have like little aha check moments of like, that reminds me of this, and though that makes so much sense here. And so this has been a more recent occurrence of this, where I could see a particular behavior that I didn't understand until that moment that I got that input. And then it was like, wow. And as soon as I understood this is crazy. I went out, it's been maybe 2 weeks since I've tried this with her, because it's been snowy and whatnot here.
Yeah.
And I went out yesterday to try it. And lo and behold, she could receive contact for the first time ever. It was like it had to shift in my mind. And then it just changed in her. And I was like, okay. So really cool process, but also I think relates on so many levels to that, unpacking of what our horses might be holding or working with, or opening up around, or needing support to open up around, right?
And what I love about this story, I remember doing some touch trainings a number of years ago and learning about what they call developmental disruptions, right? So it's not quite trauma, right? But if there's an interruption or something that was incomplete, or something that didn't unfold the way it was quote unquote intended to, and so I think of that with humans around, like an example that would be similar would be like maybe a baby that was born premature, was in an incubator for a number of months. Babies are meant to be in wombs, moving around in amniotic fluid, and like having fluid movements and stuff. We're not meant to be on our backs in an incubator with wires and tubes, where we're not moving, and so sometimes there can be certain muscle groups that don't come online in the same way.
Totally.
Right? Because you didn't develop in the amniotic fluid and didn't move around and didn't have all that mobility. And so then there's people who end up coming out into the world, and maybe they've got like less access to a particular shoulder or less access to a particular other body part. And then they don't even know that they don't have access to it, but they just go through the world. And then maybe they're a little bit more clumsy, or maybe they're not so good at throwing a ball, but then they grow up and it's minor, but then they grow up and then maybe they don't feel as physically capable. Maybe on top of that, they feel less safe in the world because, well, I can't run as fast as my fellow students, and I don't know why, and I can't seem to keep up. And then I start to have a felt sense of my body that feels less capable in some way, perhaps, and then I start to feel less safe in the world. And then maybe this disruption has now become so stacked that now, and it's all just these layers of meaning and impression and experience in the world. And now I get an experience where I wasn't able to fight back in a bad situation or something, because not only was it not safe to do so, but I don't have access to this shoulder, for instance, and I didn't realize I didn't have access to this shoulder. And so now this early developmental disruption, which seems inconsequential, has this whole trajectory. I think of the thoracic sling example as a sort of parallel, or I think of you would know these as an osteopath too, like these early primitive unintegrated reflexes.
I was going to say, like, I think of like the crawling reflex, and
I think
like
Moro with the
totally
integrated
Mm-hmm.
fear response stuff and
Totally.
integrated moral reflex, and how if there's an early primitive reflex that hasn't been integrated,
Yep.
how that can set the stage for other challenges later on in terms of emotion and connection and relationship and fear and trauma type responses. And it's like sometimes you go barking up the wrong tree, but in reality it's this early developmental incompletion thing, that is actually the quote unquote culprit. Right. And so hearing your thoracic sling story just lights up all these connections for me, because I go, oh man, like that really helped fill in the picture. When I talk trauma, to me, I include all of this stuff, even
Oh
though
yeah.
disruptions aren't traumas, but to me, it's all part of the picture, right? It's this thing that happened that didn't finish, that kind of created a limitation of sorts. And then we all shaped ourselves around this thing. And then we didn't even know we were doing it because it was just part of the thing, until we realized, oh, and it didn't take much, but then something changed,
Completely.
Mhm.
Completely.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think when we take that understanding and place it sort of atop of domestication for horses
Right.
and sort of the generalized situations that say our foals come through or whatever, right? Like, and it's obviously super general, but say you have a foal born into like a boarding stable in a small paddock,
Mm-hmm.
so a small flat sterile paddock,
Right.
where they're not getting that opportunity maybe to run with other foals or work with obstacles or changes in terrain,
Yeah.
really to activate their system on that level, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
perhaps, their mother is having challenging just attaching, or, like various things can happen there due to the scenario. And then you think of like, oh, early weaning, maybe they're placed in their own paddock. Again, they're not getting that activation that they would maybe normally have through full to full interaction and interaction with other herd members where they're getting mentorship. These sorts of things, it all kind of starts to add up, right? Where you start to see, okay, like interesting how that piece is added to this piece, and you look at horses, for example, that are in maybe various industries where they're starting quite young, and they're put into extensive work, prior to appropriate brain development, prior to, maybe they never were activated in their system in a complete way to begin with. And then we're asking, a great deal of proprioceptive activities, dexterity,
Mm-hmm.
adaptiveness in their system. We start to see, okay, these are the drops in the bucket. These are the drops in the bucket. And then when we see a horse at, 7 or 8 years old that has arthritis in the hock and, various other complications occurring, it didn't just happen then. We track it back. There's these pieces to this puzzle that occurred.
And it's interesting because earlier we started with talking about this idea of death and dying and mourning and
Mm-hmm.
loss stuff. And you were talking about like the horses in captivity that end up passing away, the causes that lead to euthanasia in captivity. Like you were saying, it's either things like colic, right? Or we're seeing things like musculoskeletal issues that have led to poor quality of life. And I was thinking back immediately to not just horses that are early weaned, but horses that are backed too young or that are started too young before all their bone structures have had a chance to completely mature, and then that becomes another stacked variable that
Yep.
contributes, right? And so it becomes really interesting when you start to look. And so I guess if I think a little bit about a question that I have, and this is sort of wild versus captivity in terms of the death and dying process. So and I'm sitting here thinking about some people who might be listening, because you were saying earlier about, well, asking the horse what they want, and some might be super specific and some might be, I just want X, and they may have fewer attachments than we do
Yep.
to right?
Totally.
They're not so attached to certain things. There might be, some might be super specific and some might be, that's just our projection. Oh, I think he'll want his blanket. That might be a
Yeah,
you thing.
totally.
Right? Like, so I get really curious about things like, okay, so allowing the horses to be with the body, if at all possible, you know, and being there and having the horse pass with the herd nearby, or, you know, within view, or being able to have the horses come in and be with the body afterwards. But as you and I both know, that isn't always possible depending on the domestic situation, because a lot of people have horses at boarding facilities where that may or may not be part of the boarding culture or the barn owner's perspectives or beliefs or what have you. And then there's going to be the issue of, you know, in the wild, if the horse dies, its body becomes
Goes
food
back
for predators or
land.
carrion, and scavengers come and eat carrion, and it body just sort of goes into the land, you know, the bones get scattered, animals come and eat, and so it just goes back to nature. And often in captivity, very few horses get buried. That's not a common thing. Many
And
places
this
are
is,
you know, so
it's
where you can't just leave your horse out in the back 50, where, you know, some people can do that and that's great, and not everyone can. And so how do you handle the cremation conversation, you know, right? And how do, like, you know what I mean? Like in terms of
I
that.
totally know what you mean. And here, you know, let me break it down to you straight. So here on the island, there is no cremation conversation.
What do you mean?
There is no crematorium for horses on the island.
Okay, so that means, right, and it wouldn't be very cost effective to put them all on the ferry to take them to the mainland.
Exactly.
Right.
People do, but it's about $6,000 to $7,000 to have your horse cremated, because they pass here, there needs to be a specific trailer.
And you couldn't bring your own, so for argument's sake, because I find this,
could bring them.
You could bring your
Mission.
horse. Okay. Okay.
You could bring them over if you knew the timing and you had a suitable location, which is a possibility. But the only crematoriums, I believe there's one in Mission and there's another one that's more of a group crematorium somewhere in the mainland. On the island, no facilities at all. Like, I had a friend that was looking more deeply into that, and it's very hard to zone. So here's the crummy traumatic for the owner piece. The horses go to the dump here. And that,
so I just felt
like, ugh.
See, and right now, like, I've got this
yuck.
Like,
so
that's a huge pang in the chest, and my
it's
gut's
awful. It's actually been something on my mind the last little bit, is like, how do I make this happen? Because for me, honoring the death and dying process is everything. And I cannot fathom ever sending my horses to the dump. I just can't. Because for me, it's just, I want to be able to, if not bury them in a place where I can visit, then like have a sense that I did what I could to honor their remains. And
I'm just going to take a moment to pause.
That's big.
What you don't know is that I have a will. So, you know, you're supposed, like, I finally got a will made. Finally.
Nice job. I haven't done it yet.
Right. I know. I follow, I'm really big into death positivity, and for about 5-6 years, I've been watching Ask a Mortician with Caitlin Doty on YouTube. I love her. She's great.
Okay.
I've watched her videos so many times. She's just comfort background, nerdy conversations around death and dying. She's an eco-friendly funeral director who's really big into like looking at eco-friendly alternatives, and this she's great. I really like her, and she's got something called the Order of the Good Death, which is all about positivity, and she's great. And so ever since paying attention to her, I've been a little bit more, okay, like, I need to get a will. I've got horses, I've got dogs, I should get on that. And have like advanced directives for how I want me to be looked after, but also like my horses, who are they going to live with whenever I die? My horses are non-ridden horses. They would need a very specific home. My horses are not trained to do anything special. I just allow my horses to be horses. And that's the contract I have with them, is I've said to them, hey, I get there's certain things you don't want to do. I'm cool with that. Like, I don't need to ride. I've got too many bodily issues. I've hurt myself too many times. I'm not planning to ride and risk more issues with my own musculoskeletal system. So I'm happy to be friends on the ground with you both. But they're not horses. And there's a guilt in this for me, because people have said, well, you're going to guarantee your horse a better life if they are rideable and they are, you know what I mean? And then do the right thing by your horse, get your horse ready to go for riding, because it guaranteed you can sell them. If you were to die, they would have another good home. I get that. I really do. And I'm not that person. My horses, you know, they're non-ridden horses. That's cool. They've both expressed that, and I'm not interested in pushing that. And so I go, okay, then my commitment to you as your steward is going to be to allow you to have this choice. But the reason I bring this up is because in my will, I had to figure out who I would give my horses to.
Totally.
Right? Because you have to think of these things. And the person who has agreed to take my horses after they die is on Vancouver Island. And I'm now finding out that my horses are going to wind up in the dump.
Oh, sweetie.
Which I didn't know, because I was thinking, okay, they'll get cremated, and then, you know, or maybe they could get buried if we're lucky, you know, and to find out that, and now I'm sitting here going, shoot, I got to find a backup plan. Like, who do they go to that's not on the island? You know,
I'm sorry.
So, no, it's okay. This is the reality of it.
This is the preparation stuff, right? It's like
reality.
And for so many people, they don't know that this is the case. And then it happens, and you can't leave the body lying there for a long time. And so you have to make this call on the fly. For me, it was like, okay, I need to figure out some solutions here, because we don't know what's going to happen. And you know, we need to have like alternatives in place so that we're able to, you know, find an option that works for us. And that was one reason why I was like, I need to reach out to this woman and figure out, is there a way to make this a thing? Because I think so many people on the island, it's cost prohibitive and other things prohibitive to have to transport a horse off island, all these things, to a veterinarian clinic that you may not know, like there's a lot of things to that, right? So it really has kind of come home to roost the last week or two, where I'm like, how do I figure this out? What are the options? Is there other options besides a crematorium that would work? Like, because there's so many horses on, you know, that are in this, and horse people that are in this scenario, and that may or may not realize that this is the case here. And you know, that hopefully it's different where you live, everyone, but it is important to know, like, what is the process, and what, if I'm at a barn, can I bury there? If I can't, what are my other ideal situations in this way? Yeah, those things are so critical to kind of have your ducks in a row, because we don't know, timing, stuff happens, and we want to feel settled in the choices that we make, right?
Let's find out
as much as possible.
Well, this is it. And this is why I'm loving the candor of this conversation, and this sort of sudden discovery of, oh, you know, what's going to happen to my horses when they die, if they go live on Vancouver Island, if I were to die before they do, you know, and hopefully this will never come to this, right? But you kind of have to think of these outcomes, right? And go, oh, shoot, I'd rather learn this now than, you know, have them go and then go, oh, and then, like, let's say you're a horse owner and you don't know this, and then you're already having to deal with all the challenges around death and dying and your horse and all these, it's already a hard experience. To find out in the moment what my horse is going to the dump, that's not the thing you want to learn when you're in the dying process with your horse. It is not. This is the kind of stuff. This is why the whole, I've been really appreciating Caitlin Doty and some of her colleagues on this death positivity movement, because it's really, opened my eyes to, oh, like, let's have these conversations, like, and like,
Absolutely.
talking about this idea of like having human composting facilities, super
Yeah.
fascinating videos on human
Super
composting.
interesting. Yeah, for
Right. One
sure.
of her colleagues is outside of Seattle, and they just had the first human composting facility in Washington State is now, and that's really close to us,
Yeah.
and it's like really cool. And the video on that is fascinating. I go, wow, could we have that for horses? And then I think to myself,
Yep.
well, what would it take to just allow the body to compost
Yeah.
in the wild and nature the way it was intended to? And then I think, well, is that a biohazard because horses have vaccines in them and stuff? And then, but then I
Yeah.
think, well, human bodies in the ground full of formaldehyde, how is that any
Totally.
worse? Like, and I think to myself, gosh, there's got to be a way around this. Like, how can we just let the nature
Yep.
take its course? But I get that there's biohazard issues there if the horse is pumped full of certain drugs and medications, and you don't want to introduce that into the wildlife
Yep.
population. So this is where like the composting facility idea is super cool as this
Yeah.
alternative. It's not cremation, it's composting, but humans are much smaller.
We're much more little. Absolutely.
Thing, but for horses are massive animals. But the human composting thing is about 30 days, I think, is 30
Well,
days.
and I was going to say, and these are the kind of technologies that I want to start researching because,
Sure.
I just think it's so amazing. And that, and it's funny, like, I'm sure there's people out there that are kind of shaking their head and being like, oh my gosh, like, I think I am definitely like a morbid-ish person, and it's such a pleasure to chat with you about this because, here's one thing that I see is a lot of people will go, I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to put it out there into the universe.
We're
I
gonna
don't want to
heads up,
even,
all of us are gonna die.
I know, I don't even want to entertain the idea. And I'm like,
But
you got to entertain the idea because the more prepared you are, the more you can enjoy this time and not worry about it and not be afraid of it, because you have at least some ducks in a row and you have a sense of what's going to be the best process for you and your horse and for yourself, whatever it is, right? That's where I get to, is like, you don't want to be surprised about this. It's not a good place to be.
This is it. That's just to add to the trauma, but this is the
Exactly.
trauma, right? Is I either have to deal with it now, which is uncomfortable, or I have to deal with it later, which is even more uncomfortable. Pick your poison.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, guess what? What the cool thing is about all of this is that there are people who are open to having these conversations.
Totally.
And there are ways to have these conversations in a way that maybe is less scary. And if it's hard for you to even think about death and dying because there's trauma around that for you, or you've coped in your life by contracting and compressing and suppressing and, all this stuff, then there are body workers and somatic therapists and different people who can help you grow your capacity in your own being and your own nervous system to be with more of the ebbs and flows that come along with some of these topics, so that you can have more space within yourself to be with some of this stuff, because it isn't easy, and at the same time, it's part of life. The minute we're born, we are in the process of dying. That sounds more, but it's true. We just don't know when. And some of us it's sooner than others. And our horses will die too, and our dogs and our cats. And I'm thinking about that for my dogs. I've got Trigger, who's now 8.5, almost 9.
Totally. Riley just turned 8. Yep.
And Tron is about 2. And Sally dog, when she passed in 2014, she was about 15 years old. She's a rescue. All my dogs are rescues. My horses, I know their backgrounds. My dogs, they're all mostly rescues. I don't have as much history on my dogs. But Sally, like, that was tough, and I knew her time was coming, and I had a sense intuitively of what her process would be. Trigger, I don't know when he's going to go, but I've already been thinking, okay, when he does, I want Tron to be there, so that she's able to be in the room when it happens, or if the vet comes to my house. I haven't figured out exactly what it's going to look like yet, but my advance directive is I would like, and I know advance directives are what you give to someone to deal with after you've died, so they know how to handle your wishes. But, like, my own advance directive for me towards my dog in life is I would like Tron to be able to be there so she can have that transition time.
Yep.
So these are conversations, and
Big
Alexa,
time.
I'd love to do this again. And if my friend Karen's willing, I'd love to see if she's
That'd be super
good in
cool. Yeah.
having a conversation. I think it would be really a lovely chat.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
they're interesting topics. And if these are topics that you're interested in, I mean, let's continue the conversation. I mean, what are other options that we can have for horses? I mean, like sometimes you can't have the horse die at home with its friends because it
Yep.
dies in hospital, because something happened,
Totally.
there was a surgery that went wrong, and so, bringing the tail hairs back to the herd and having the
Yep.
something that has
Yeah.
the scent, how do we help mark those transitions, and how
Yeah.
are we supporting the
Mm,
humans, because the horses often were safer than a lot of the relationships with other people.
absolutely. I think there's like two pieces that I want to add there before
Yeah.
we wrap up. And, one for me is, sitting with, and this is why I love the idea of being prepared and like really getting to a place where you can actually show up for your horse, because that means you're able to, number one, anchor the space. Number two, listen to them about what this process wants to be for them, for it to be the most sort of graceful and like in the flow for them. So there's this piece around, what does it look like to honor them?
Yeah.
What does it look like to honor my horse in their passing? Even if it's sudden, like, even if it's unexpected, what would that look like? Because it kind of puts this, it gives us a sense of not necessarily a full completion, but that like we've given back in that
Mhm.
moment some of what they've given to us,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. So, for example, I just interviewed someone for the podcast and it's going to be coming out soon. And she had this beautiful gray stallion that passed.
Mhm.
And she, her part of her honoring was oh my gosh, like I saw the photos and I was just like, oh, this is so beautiful, Sarah. Like she literally covered, his whole mane was roses,
Yeah.
like white and red roses, and just flowers all around his head. Like it was just so beautiful. I was so moved by that, because you knew that she'd taken hours to be with him and go through that process with him. Like it was just so beautiful. And so that, creating, taking a little bit of tail, with permission or mane, and making something, creating, like when a friend's horse passed tragically, I needed something to honor her because I was involved in a way, and it was like heavy on my heart. And I was like, what can I do? I just sat with that. And I actually ended up painting her
Mm-hmm.
and gifting it to her person for her altar, for her horse. And that, like, it did something inside me to settle me and bring her to life, right? Because we always think, okay, the physical body, not always, but a lot of us, it's like the physical body's gone and there's this goneness about that moment. And yes, that physical piece, but the memories and the energetic aspect, like that's here, that's with us. And if we can honor it and bring it to life through this next piece, which is legacy. What is my legacy for this horse? Like what do they want to offer up into the world now as a part of their teachings, as a part of what they gave to me and that I can now give out to my community, right? So that's like the next piece of it, right? And that really encourages that sense of completion.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I love
Yeah.
that, because it really is that coming full circle. So, and what
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing in all of this is ultimately, regardless of what trauma work you do on your early sequencing and your early stuff and whatever, there's a beauty in the completion of this other piece, so even if this other stuff didn't get a chance to happen in this lifetime, at least the ending is drawing to a close in as best as way as possible, again, not perfectly. So there's the planning piece, there's ritual in how the moment,
there's ritual and ceremony,
and ceremony, legacy. And then I think about this idea of within grief and loss and mourning, which is also the being kind with ourselves for what we didn't get to do, what we weren't able to do differently, because maybe it didn't unfold the way that we wanted, or we didn't have the full capacity, or maybe we weren't able to fully work through our own emotional ties and entanglements with our horse or our dog or whatever before the animal passed. And so there's this sense of guilt or shame and blame for what we wished we could have done differently, but we couldn't have because it's just not where we were at, or the circumstances were too hard. And so in this pattern of like preparation and the planning and the moment and the transition and ritual and legacy sort of stuff, there's the, can I be kind with myself? May I be gentle with myself? Sometimes the conditions are just not what we wish it could be, and we're not where we might be in 10 years from now, or in 4 weeks from now, or in 2 years from now. And so that kindness towards ourselves.
I think of the word forgiveness. It's just this sense of, forgiving ourselves for being exactly where we're at that time. When we know better, we do better. But like you say, it's we are where we are right in that moment. And that is exactly, I've taught a couple of workshops, call them Death Sucks, the workshop. And it is a mess. Let me tell you, like we go through like 4 boxes of Kleenex. It is nuts. And, but one of the exercises we do is we do sort of an intuitive, like almost like automatic writing process with a previous pet, one that is past, either fairly close or long time ago. And I remember one gal connected with a dog that she'd had when she was very young, like it would have been maybe 20 years previous. And she'd been in a really, really difficult situation at the time, a violent situation. And this dog protected her. He was just a little fella, but that was his thing. That was what he offered up. And she had all this guilt about where she was at that time and what he might have had to go through and how it all went. And I just remember that when she finally connected to what his gift had been, like what his teaching had been, and just this sense of the immense relief when she finally just forgave herself and went, he was there to love me, no matter what. And it was the perfect thing, like, in the perfect timing. Right. But I just remember it was such a big moment because of the extremeness of the scenario and just the amount of guilt she was holding on to around this relationship. Right. So that is a part of this process too, is that piece, right? And we can go back, like if you feel like, oh, I never did, I never honored in the way that I wanted to, and thought about the legacy of an animal that I lost that was super important. You can always go back. You can always, like there's always time to if that feels like it's a piece for you to find some sense of closure, you can start now. It's like, it's not comfy, but it's really beautiful and often just moves the dial on everything else, right? Because like, as it's this sense of all these sort of just like uncompleted things, right? It's like that we drag along with us
until we don't have a choice but to face them at some point.
Right.
And
this is a way.
Too, and if there was a pet that died or a horse that died for you, that the ending was traumatic, because
Yeah.
here's the thing, death is a part of life. It is just how this goes. And sometimes deaths are not always beautiful, easy endings, right? There are tragic, traumatic deaths.
Terrible deaths. Yep.
100%. And for some people, this whole conversation may be very challenging because it's bringing up memories of traumatic deaths. There are therapy methods that can help with working through that. Somatic experiencing, brain spotting, EMDR, these are all really helpful somatic, brain-based, memory-based work methods that can help with working with your nervous system and with what's left over from these difficult experiences, so that the therapies will not take away what has happened, but will help to work through it and deactivate it in such a way that it doesn't carry the shock or the horror in the same way that it does if it's still unfinished, or it still is sitting in its raw traumatic memory format in your mind and in your body. And so know that there are ways of working through that. It's not something you have to carry with you like a rucksack of awful, like it is something that is it's workable. So know that you're not alone in that as well, if you're struggling with a traumatic loss. So
Yeah, I think that's super important to share, because in those situations, more than anything, when you're getting a scenario like that, where there's not only grief, but shock and often guilt and anger, maybe, like all these, there's so much
that's coupled
there. It's so challenging. And really appreciate you highlighting that piece, because then of course you're terrified of it happening in the future, and you don't want to look at it, and right.
So I just really appreciate, Alexa, that we had this chat today. I was like, I'm curious to see where this is going to go. And
Me too.
I'm really glad it went this way, because, I've had colleagues in the last little while, a dear colleague of mine, her young horse died, a few months old, just died a couple of days ago. In the last day probably, and another colleague had to put a youngster donkey down due to chronic early trauma health issues, and so I'm just really sitting with this theme right now, and it seems very timely, so I'm really grateful that it's what emerged today. It just seems to be in a lot of people's fields, and in my Facebook feed right now, I scroll through and I don't know everybody who's on my Facebook anymore, because everyone asks to befriend me, and I'm like, sure, and we seem to have 18 people in common, why not? And so as a result, there's all these stories now populating in my newsfeed of people I haven't gotten to know yet, and there's been a lot of loss recently as I scroll through, and I go, oh, so interesting. This is very timely, so I'm really grateful we had a chance to chat about this today.
Me too. There's not always it's not always the space and time for it, but
no, certainly.
Such an important conversation. Yeah. Yay.
And I'm just grateful. So thanks, Alexa. And I'm inspired now to go look into what are the bioethic issues around horse composting, because I'm like, I would be like really excited to see what options there are for Vancouver Island and other places that don't have crematoriums, because
Absolutely.
I really am interested in doing a bit more research. So thank you for prompting that little.
Yeah. And if anybody is out there listening that, knows some stuff, reach out. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah. Yay. Good. And I wanted to share, if anybody's interested in my book, it is on Amazon. It's called Death Sucks, a straight up guide to navigating your pet's spinal transition. And I think that, what's that?
Put the link in the description, along with your links to your Whole Horse podcast and your Whole Horse Apprenticeship and your other stuff.
Yay. Sorry for the noise, everybody. My wolfhound is slamming his tail on the door.
Well, that's probably a good time for us to wrap up. So I'll just pause the recording here, Alexa, and then I'll say bye after we're done recording. But thank you again so much for being part of the conversation today.
Absolute pleasure, for sure. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Alexa.